Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad you're here. My name's Ashley Laporte, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Grief 101 workshop hosted by Mary Washington Grief Support Services. Grief touches all of us at some point in our lives, and today's conversation is meant to offer understanding, support, reassurance wherever you may be in your own journey. We're honored to be joined by Mary Bevan, our community bereavement liaison with Mary Washington Grief Support Services. Mary brings deep experience, compassion, and a thoughtful approach to helping individuals and families navigate loss. Today, Mary will walk us through Grief 101, what grief work can look like, common experiences, and helpful ways to care for yourself and support others. We'll also have time for a live Q&A at the end, so feel free to share your questions in the comments as we go. Whether you're here for yourself, for someone you love, or simply to learn more, we're grateful you chose to spend this time with us. With that, I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you to everyone who's watching along or listening in later. Like Ashley said, this is such an important topic, and I really am honored to be able to share some insights and hopefully some help for you if you are a grieving person or if you're here to support another person. So we will jump right in. This is a poem by an author named Sarah Ryan. Honestly, I follow her on Instagram, which is where I find most of her work, but she does have a few books that she's published. But I just love the way that she captures the grief experience. So I'll read this one for you. When the waves stop rushing toward the shore, when the earth stands still and the stars shine no more, when the color blue forgets the sky, when the mountains fall and the deserts cry, when the sun turns cold and the moon splits in two, that's when I'll stop missing you. And that really does capture the spirit of what we'll be talking about today. So hold those words in your mind as you listen along. So my work really centers on loss due to death, but I wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that there are many types of loss that we can experience throughout our life, and therefore many types of grief that we experience. This is just kind of a smattering. You could experience divorce or health challenges, a friendship ending, job loss, a house fire, and the list goes on. But just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that there are many types of loss that we experience throughout our lives. And while the context of our conversation today is about grief due to the death of a loved one, some of the principles definitely apply to these other types of grief and loss that you've experienced or may experience in your life. So we have these two words that really we use kind of synonymously or interchangeably in our language as a culture. But I think I just wanted to take a minute to differentiate between the two. So grief refers to a person's reaction to loss, which is comprised of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that change over time. We can think of grief as our internal experience of the grief experience of our loss, the way we're processing our loss. Mourning, on the other hand, is often described as the outward expression of grief. So this might be things like crying, journaling, attending the funeral. It's really kind of the work of the mourning. So while grief are those internal processes, mourning is the way that we are externally processing those things. And then, of course, we also use the term mourning to describe the period after the loss. If you've heard me speak before, I often think about those Victorian ladies all dressed in black. And I think that there's something that we've maybe lost as a culture to not have those outward symbols of mourning, because it is something that is affecting our whole selves, mind, body, spirit. And we'll certainly talk about that more in a minute. But I think that there's something beneficial about having those symbols to show others that, hey, I'm still in this period of mourning. I'm still possibly struggling and having a tough time. I could use some extra grace or support. But those are the two terms, and I will mostly be using the word grief, but just knowing that there are kind of these two separate parts of the grieving process. And I will say that an author and grief researcher, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, has written extensively on this topic. In fact, we use one of his books, Understanding Your Grief, for a book study that we do. So if you are interested, you'll get my contact information at the end, and you can send me a message and sign up for our next book study. So I'm going to talk about three common myths just briefly, just so we can kind of all be on the same page as we work our way through this information. The first is that all people grieve in the same predictable way, and that's just not the case. We all grieve very differently, and this is true from person to person, but also the people who are grieving the same loss. Like, let's say it was our dad that passed away. Me and my siblings might all be grieving in a different way. We have a different relationship with the person, and we have had our own life experiences that impact the way that we grieve. Next is that healing from grief involves getting over the loss and generally takes a year. And I think that this myth is actually perpetuated by some of our systems that were intended to be helpful, but kind of make us feel like after a year we should be better. All hospices are required by Medicare to offer grief support to the families of the people that they've cared for who have passed away. And those services are offered for 13 months after the loss. So many of the calls that I get from people are, well, it's been a year and I'm not feeling like myself again, or I'm still having a hard time. And I just want to normalize that it is a very short time. A year is a very short time after the loss to have any sense of normalcy, especially if the person who died was a really important person in your life. So if this is you, if you have been grieving for over a year and it feels like it's still ongoing, that's normal, that's expected. And then the last one is it's better to not think or talk about the pain. And I think this is really kind of a common experience in our culture for all types of pain, and not just, emotional pain due to a loss, but the pain we experience for all sorts of things in our life. We tend to be a culture that doesn't want to talk about it. We do things to numb the pain and to try to push it away. And we'll see as we talk about some of these things that actually part of the healing process and the process of moving through grief is to experience that pain in a safe way. So some factors that impact grief, and I don't want anybody to hear these as some sort of hierarchy. There is no hierarchy when it comes to grief. Your grief happened to you and you alone, and the way you experience it is yours alone. And it's not like a competition where somebody's grief is better or worse than somebody else's. But these are just some things that impact the way that we are experiencing our grief journey. So first is the relationship with the deceased. This is if they were your dad or your mom or your sister or your child or your cousin or your friend. Second is the nature of the relationship. Was this a close, loving relationship? Was it one that had some distance? Maybe you were physically separated. Maybe you were the caregiver. There's a lot of ways that we can describe the nature of the relationship. This next one is the circumstances of the death. This is the way that the person died. Did they maybe have a disease that they were progressing through for a long time, like Alzheimer's or dementia? Or maybe they had a very sudden death, like a heart attack or a car accident, maybe something in between. But those circumstances and the way that you experience the death, maybe the way you found out about the death, all impacts the way that you are then going to grieve. If you've had other losses, these might be losses that are happening at the same time. Like, for example, maybe you had to quit your job in order to care for the person. Maybe that person was the breadwinner in the family. Now you have to sell your home. Maybe you've had other losses previously in your life, like a parent that passed away when you were younger, and now you've had a loss as an adult. There are many different examples we could talk about. Those are just a few. Next is your coping skills. We are all raised to have various coping skills. Some of these things are internal or intrinsic abilities that we're kind of born with or that we are nurtured with at a very young age. Some of these are things we learn over the years. You can learn new coping skills, but when the death happens, when you are starting that grieving process, you only have the skills that you have, and some have more and healthier coping skills, and some have fewer or more maladaptive coping skills. And that impacts the way that you're going to move through the grief process. Next is your support system. I read once that a person's support system is the single most predictive factor in kind of how well they're going to move through the grieving process. And I'd say this is especially important when we're talking about children, although the focus of this presentation is mostly geared towards adults, but we can keep children in mind always. But it is also very true of adults that having a support system, people checking in on you, people bringing you meals, people helping you, navigate. Maybe it was your husband that passed away and he always did the yard work. So now you have a neighbor who steps in and helps you out with that. So having that support system to carry you through, especially in the first weeks and months after the loss, while you're still kind of adjusting to life without that person, can be extremely helpful. And then lastly, other stressors. I think the one that I hear most often is that most companies have bereavement policies that allow you 3 days off of work. Well, I just said in my previous slide that grief takes much longer than a year, and honestly, a lifetime. So having 3 days where, maybe that was time enough to go to the funeral home and, have some sort of memorial service. But the idea of kind of then having to jump back into work or jump back into caring for your children or managing your own health challenges, any of those things or many other things, those stressors kind of are a challenge when you're trying to move through the grief process. All right. So we are going to talk about these 3 grief theories. This one is from Dr. William J. Worden. Actually, I think it's J. William Worden. But these are the 4 tasks of grief. The graphic that I have here is a cute little acronym, TEAR. But the explanation for these is a little bit deeper, but this is a nice catchy way to put this in a little slide. So we have the first task, which is to accept the reality of the loss. And really this is that, most of us, many of us, when we have heard that our person has passed away, it's this sense of disbelief, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. You may have experienced yourself or heard from grieving people that they kind of wake up and are, all of a sudden flooded with the sensation that their person has passed away. Maybe they forget that the person has passed away and they say, oh, I should go tell this person X, Y, and Z. So this is an important part of the grieving process, is to kind of come to terms with the reality that the person has passed away. Next up is to experience the pain of the loss. And again, like I said previously, we are a pain avoidant culture. So it can be difficult to allow yourself to experience the pain, and it's painful. It hurts to, really accept that the person isn't here and that they're not coming back. But it is an important part of integrating the loss into your life as you move forward to really let the reality and the feelings of that loss kind of settle in you. Next is to adjust to the new environment without the lost person. And this you'll see on my next slide. I think it explains it in more detail, but it's really this idea of getting used to the person not being here. And that might be really tricky, but you're learning new roles and you're having to learn new things. Like I mentioned, yard work. Maybe that's something that you all had a division of labor in your home, and now that's a task that you've had to learn new skills on, or cooking dinner, or maybe going back to work, whatever the thing may be. But this adjustment to a new identity, who are you now? How has this loss changed you? And who are you kind of without this other person physically here? And then the last one, the kind of shorthand and to fit in the acronym, it says reinvest in the new reality. But the actual task, I think, is written a little bit more clearly, which is to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So it's kind of this both and. You are investing in life, moving forward, doing new things, learning new things, and you're learning to carry the person with you, which we will talk about later on how to do that. Now, I want to just be really clear that these are not check boxes. We're not saying, okay, I did T, now I did E, now I did A, now I did R. And while these are things that are important as you're grieving to process through and to, touch on each of these things, some people might spend a long time in a certain category. I'd say that could be any of them, just depending on your circumstances. But they also don't necessarily happen linearly. We're not doing one and then moving on to the next. Because think about it, if you're reinvesting in the new reality, you're also adjusting to the new environment. You're also likely experiencing the pain and accepting the reality. So it is kind of, they're interconnected and you're likely experiencing them simultaneously. But it's really just to get you thinking about, kind of moving through the grief process and learning to do these things as you're moving along. Okay. This one I really like because I think it is a good picture of what naturally happens as we're moving through the grief process. So this is the dual process model of grief. And what you see is on one side we have loss oriented, on the other side we have restoration oriented, and then in the middle we have everyday life. And you see you with the little squiggly line. The idea is that while we're grieving, we're doing the tasks of the mourning, the loss, right? The grief work, like we talked about in the TEAR acronym from Dr. Warden. So what we're doing is missing the person, thinking about your old life, maybe doing grief work like attending a support group or reading a book and doing like a workbook. But it's the work of the grief. You'll see the last one, focusing on the life before. And then on the other side, the restoration-oriented things are those things in task 3 and 4. So the restoration-oriented things are figuring out your new role and identity, adjusting to new family roles, forming new relationships, doing new things. This might be maybe picking up a hobby that you had not done in the past, or joining a new group for something that you enjoy. It could be any type of thing that is kind of the new life, the moving forward life. But what you'll see is this line going back and forth where we naturally bounce back and forth between the loss-oriented and the restoration-oriented. And like I said, I think it just so perfectly captures what our natural experience is, that this one to me doesn't feel like work in any way. This one is just kind of like the reality. Now, you likely will find that in the beginning of the loss, right after the loss, the beginning of your grief work, you are spending a lot of time in the loss-oriented side. And at some point, that pendulum kind of shifts where you're spending a lot more time on the restoration-oriented side. Now, here's the catch, is that there's no timeline for that. There's no moment when you're all of a sudden always on the restoration-oriented side. When you love somebody or when you have a person who's important to you who passes away, you're gonna still have them as part of your life in whatever way that looks like. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the idea of the pain of the loss and the relationship with that person, your life together, your memories, the pictures of them, all those things, you're gonna continue to go back to that indefinitely, forever. And the frequency of that will likely get less over time, but it will always be there. And so just a gentle reminder that if this is you, that it's okay to be spending a lot of time on the loss-oriented side, and it's okay to be dipping your toe in the restoration-oriented side. You can do more as you feel comfortable and ready. This one is our last grief theory. This is called Growing Around Grief, and by Dr. Lois Tonkin. She facilitated grief groups in the 90s and then did this research study to kind of back up her findings. And what you'll see is the red ball is our grief. So it says, people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. So you'll see in the top row, the grief is kind of getting smaller. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. And so in this bottom one, we see our grief ball is always the same size, but our life has grown bigger around it. And what I always think about is that ball kind of bouncing around inside of us, right? So at the beginning, like in that second circle on the bottom where it says the same size, our ball is kind of constantly jiggling up against those pain points, right? Because our life is still really connected and close to the grief and to the time when the person passed away. But as we are investing in the new reality, as we're moving forward, as we're doing new things, as we're kind of bouncing back into the restoration oriented side a little more often, our life begins to grow. We have new experience, more time passes, grandchildren are born, we go back to work, like whatever the things are, and our life gets bigger. And what I think is really important here is that still, though, even though our life has gotten bigger, when that pain ball hits, right, it's going to hit less often, but when it hits, it can sometimes still knock us off our feet the way it did the first day that we found out about the person dying. The pain doesn't necessarily get smaller. The frequency of the pain is what gets less over time. And again, there is no timeline for this. There isn't an end point where we say, okay, well, my life got so big that, my balls stopped hitting up against those pain points. It will likely always be that things remind us of the person, and the feeling might change to more of a nostalgia or more of kind of bittersweet feeling. But the pain itself likely isn't going to resolve, but it won't hurt as bad as it hurts today. Okay. I know I've kind of said this a little bit throughout so far, but I want to make it really clear that grief affects the whole person. And so we have these 4 realms of kind of what makes us who we are. It's our emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual selves. And so we're going to kind of break this down a little bit and talk about how we are affected by grief and then some things that can help. So on the mental and emotional side, fear that another loss will happen soon. This is so common in both kids and adults. And it really is just like, wow, if this happened, it like rocks your world. It makes you feel unsafe and unsettled. If this could happen, then what else could happen? Crying at unexpected times. A lot of the literature calls these grief bursts. So kind of out of nowhere, maybe you're in the grocery store buying carrots, or you're in the car driving, wherever you are, and kind of the tears come out of nowhere. Sometimes it's because of some sort of trigger, like a song that reminded you of the person, or driving by a place that they liked. But sometimes it truly is kind of seemingly out of nowhere, and knowing that that's normal. Needing to tell the story over and over. And I always say this can be either the story of the person's life or their death. I think that it's very common to want to tell the story of how they passed away. But some people don't want to do that, and they want to kind of focus and remember on the person as they lived, and to tell that story, and that's okay. I should say too that these are examples of common symptoms of grief. So if you have experienced anything on this list, those are normal, but it's not an exhaustive list. So if you have experienced something that's not on this list, that could very well be a normal symptom of grief. It just didn't make it on my list. The next one is expecting to see or hear the deceased as if nothing has happened. And I think of all the things on any of my lists, this one is probably the one that is the most painful, because it again kind of takes you back to those moments of, like that realization that the person has passed away, and it's so painful. In fact, there's a griefy person named Megan Riordan Jarvis, and Megan Jarvis Riordan. But she was telling a story one time about how her mom had passed away 10 years ago, and she heard a song on the radio or a story on whatever, and her immediate thought was, oh my gosh, I've got to call and tell her. 10 years. So just to say that it is normal for this to happen, but boy, is it painful. And then the last one is absent-mindedness. Sometimes we refer to this as brain fog, but it's kind of that feeling of forgetfulness, feeling like you can't make decisions, just forgetting things, like where you put something or an appointment on your calendar. But really that feeling of like, just kind of feeling hazy, like you're just not all there. On the spiritual side, we kind of can experience this on both spectrums. So one would be a loss of meaning or direction after the person dies, but it may also be searching for a new meaning, or both. And again, questioning your faith or experiencing changes in your belief or finding comfort or solace in your faith. And honestly, it might be a mixture of those things at different times in your grief journey. And that's okay. It's okay to not have it be a very clean and clear line. It's okay for it to be squiggly and uncertain. And then lastly, is the physical side. Sleep disturbances are very common. We see difficulty falling asleep as probably the primary symptom that people describe. But secondly would be difficulty falling asleep, like waking up a lot at night and then having trouble falling back asleep. So then you have these long periods of wakefulness during the night. And the sleep disturbances, I think they're partly because of all the changes that are going on inside of us, like truly physically, like on a chemical level, with like our stress hormones and things like that, but also just the anxiety and the anxious thoughts that can come along with grief. Next is a lowered resistance to illness. Again, this is true of any time that we're experiencing a period of stress. Our bodies are more susceptible to illness. But it's, of course, especially common when we're grieving, and that is an especially challenging type of stress to navigate because it, again, hits all areas of our life. Next is changes in appetite, and this could be eating more or eating less. And then lastly is physical aches, and I'd say the two most common are stomach aches and headaches, but some people even describe like kind of a full-on body ache, like almost like you have the flu. And so again, you may or may not have experienced these things, but just wanted to normalize that these are things that can happen when you're grieving. I will always just put a caveat, especially for the physical symptoms, that you always want to get checked out by your physician, just to make sure that you don't have anything else going on that could also explain these symptoms. But just knowing that if kind of there's nothing there on a physical level, that this could be your grief kind of having a psychosomatic response. The other thing too is that a lot of people who are grieving were previously caregivers. You know, if your person had been sick for a long or short time, you likely weren't taking care of yourself, which is very loving and kind to have been so devoted to your person. But it is important to kind of check in with your physical health after your person passes away if you hadn't been to the doctor in a long time, just to make sure that you're doing okay physically. Okay, so what helps? So again, we're kind of looking at these coping strategies with mind, body, spirit kind of in mind, that we are doing things that are going to support us in all of those realms. So these are just some ideas. Again, these might not work for you. These might not be things that are helpful to you. That's okay. They're just ideas. But I'd love to help you brainstorm some things that might help. So here on this list, we have reading grief books. I have a huge list of books for both adults and children that I'd love to share with you if you're interested. The library system in Fredericksburg also has tons of grief resources. So you can search on their page or talk to a librarian. I'm sure they'd love to help you. And then of course you can buy the books wherever you buy your books. Journaling can be really helpful just to kind of get your thoughts out. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in our minds that it can be helpful to get it out on paper. And then maybe you can use that as kind of a bouncing off point. You know, oh, wow, look back to 3 months ago, how you were doing. And now, wow, look how much I've grown and changed. Or look how well I thought I was doing. And now I feel like, wow, I'm back at the beginning, a very normal feeling. But it can be helpful to get those thoughts kind of out of us. Doing acts of kindness. This actually comes from our depression literature. That has shown, they've done studies that doing an act of kindness kind of lifts people out of depressive episodes. And so thinking about your own community, your own family, where can you do some acts of kindness? Having healthy boundaries. I talk a lot about this when I'm talking about grief and the holidays, but it certainly pertains to any time, any season. But it's really this idea of, especially while you're grieving, to be able to say no to things that feel like they're too much. You know, maybe you always go to, do bowling on Thursday nights and like now you can barely get out of bed. Maybe you have to just say, you know what, I need to step back from that for a little while. It really could be anything, but it's the idea of kind of exercising your no muscle and checking in with yourself and saying, am I up for this? Am I at a place where I can do this? And it's okay if the answer is no. Feel your feelings. So this takes us again back to our 4 tasks of mourning. Sitting with your feelings. This might be with a journal. This might be with a friend. This might be with a therapist. This might just be with yourself. But just taking a moment when those feelings come, just to let them wash over you. I find waves to be an exceptionally helpful metaphor here when we're talking about our feelings, is that feelings wash over us. They don't feel good, but then they go back out into the ocean. And they might come again. They might be hitting you with wave after wave, especially, closer to the time of the loss or on special holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. But it's important to feel those feelings and to not immediately push them away. Now, here I am talking about coping strategies. So we can do things to help relieve some of the pain and to help us in healthy ways. But knowing that it's okay to sit with that pain for a bit and to just let it wash over you. So phoning a friend, joining a support group. We'll tell you a little bit more about our support groups at the end, but there's certainly other ones out there for you. And then mood boosters. Grief is this kind of all-encompassing experience, right? And sometimes we are sitting in the pain, and we just need a break. You just need a few minutes of watching a funny video or watching a comedy movie with your family, listening to upbeat songs and having a dance party. Something where you're kind of lifted out of the heaviness and the pain for a short time, because our bodies weren't meant to sustain that for that long. And it is important to have a break from it. And some people find, going to work is a break, or going to get coffee with a friend, like whatever the thing is that works for you, but knowing that it's okay and giving yourself permission to laugh, to, kind of push your grief aside for a minute. And again, thinking about our dual process model of grief, where we're going back and forth between those two things, we just want to make sure we're going back and forth, right? We don't want to be stuck in one side or the other. We want to do things that help us in both directions. Next up is bilateral movement. So there's a lot of literature about bilateral movement that's come out in the last 10 or 15 years or so. But it's a way to kind of reset your parasympathetic nervous system. So when you're feeling anxious or stressed, these are things that can kind of bring you back and get your kind of 2 feet on the ground. The 2 examples I have are walking. So bilateral is literally both sides. So you are moving both sides of your body when you're walking, your feet. You also have the added benefit, depending on where you're walking, you could potentially be in nature. You could be listening to uplifting music, like whatever. So you might incorporate other skills. But honestly, just doing some deep breathing and this bilateral movement can be very helpful. So walking is one. This other one I have is called tapping. And it's exactly what it sounds like. My favorite is called butterfly. And you literally crisscross your arms and then you alternate tapping your shoulders while you take some deep breaths. Now, ideally you do this for 3 to 5 minutes. We might not have that much time. So even if you could just do it for a short time, it can be helpful. And I think anything you can do to kind of interrupt those thoughts can be helpful. Again, we're letting the feelings wash over us with those waves. But sometimes we need a break. Sometimes we just need to calm down. Maybe we're feeling those feelings, but then we're kind of getting into some sort of anxiety spiral. So things like this can help you kind of reset and bring you back to the present moment. Next up is eating healthy food and drinking water. This is just kind of good advice for life, but especially when you're grieving, it can be really hard to care for yourself, even to meet those basic needs. So just remember, especially if you're having a day where you're just feeling really off and icky, drink some water. And sometimes that can help kind of move you through the day a little bit. Next on my list is get enough sleep. Well, you just heard me say a couple slides ago that sleep can be a challenge when you're grieving. So getting really familiar with sleep hygiene, so those habits that can remind your body that it's time to sleep. And even if you're not sleeping, you're still in your bed, resting with your phone off, and just kind of having some quiet time. And hopefully your body will get back into the rhythm and routine of sleeping. And then last on this one is hobbies, engaging in hobbies. These could be things that maybe you put aside while you were a caregiver that now you want to get back into. Maybe you're remembering a hobby from your youth, you making friendship bracelets or going bowling or whatever. Or maybe it's something new that you're going to try. And again, this kind of, depending on the hobby, could have a dual help, which, some hobbies like sports, pickleball, or bowling or whatever, a walking club, you're with other people, which can be really helpful. And even if it's a hobby you do on your own, it could be something as simple as learning to crochet, or starting a card club in your neighborhood, like playing cards. So it doesn't matter what the hobby is, but sometimes engaging in that can be helpful to your coping. And then last on our list of coping strategies, this one we're thinking more about our spiritual health. So meditating or praying, spending time in nature. I always think about the kids saying touch grass when I think of that one. But really there's a lot of truth in being in nature and the way it helps us have a mental and emotional reset. Creating rituals. This is one that I think is not talked about enough, is the importance of ritual in our life in general, but also in our coping while we're grieving. Some people do things that they don't think are rituals, but they really are. Like, you hear of people going to visit the cemetery every Sunday. That's their ritual that helps them stay connected to their person. Maybe they talk to the person, but they're doing it kind of regularly and consistently. That's a ritual. The one that always comes to mind for me is a child I worked with many years ago. Her father had passed away, and every night before she went to sleep, she had a picture of him, and she would kiss it and say, "Good night, Daddy," and then she would go to sleep. And that was a ritual that helped her feel safe and comfortable and connected to her dad. And I think it's a really good one. Maybe we should all take that over. I've heard of some families doing something where they light a candle, or just, talk to a picture of the person, whatever it is, but something that you're kind of doing consistently as part of your healing process. And then lastly is reading spiritual texts. And this could be either spiritual texts about grief or just whatever spiritual text your religious tradition follows. All right. So now we're talking about secondary losses, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there that when a person dies, it's not just the person, the death of the person that causes us grief. It's kind of this thing, again, it encapsulates our whole life. And so you'll see some of the things on here. I think a really pertinent one for a lot of people who I've worked with is loss of dreams for the future. I've worked before I was just doing bereavement work, I worked with a lot of families in hospice. And this is one I heard a lot. People getting diagnosed with a life-limiting illness like right when they were retiring. And so it's like all those dreams of this time that this couple thought that they had together, that they didn't get to spend that time together. Loss of an income, loss of your support system. So the list goes on. But just wanting to take a moment to acknowledge that it's not just the death of the person, it's these other secondary losses that affect us. Excuse me. Okay, now talking briefly about support systems. So what you see in the middle is you, the person, and then you have these concentric circles, which are these other places that you can find support. Some people have very few people that they can identify in each of these categories. Some people have tons and tons. I do think it's a helpful exercise if you feel like you're kind of struggling to see who is here to support me, who do I have, who can I call on? Just to do an activity kind of like this and kind of look beyond where you might normally look. So you'll see here we have family and friends. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Neighbors, community, and established support groups. So like, for example, if you started coming to one of our support groups, you would now have people in that category. Organizations and institutions, this is more like a church or the Moose Lodge, like VFE, yeah, VFW, there we go, that's what I was trying to say. But these things that are like part of they're your community organizations, the places that you would go to, be out in the community but they're like established institutions and organizations. Um, and then lastly is health and social care professionals. So this is like going to see your doctor, like we talked about for your physical health, and then going to see like a psychiatrist or a therapist if you need kind of additional support for your mental health. But I do think it's kind of an interesting activity for each of us to do, to kind of look at who do we have, who is there for us, and where can I create more support. And so that takes me to this one, and you'll see one of the questions I have on there. Do others reach out to me, or do I need to reach out? And I think in an ideal world, people would just be flooding us with offers of help. Can I bring you a meal? Can I drive your kids to soccer? Can I drive you to church? Can I go buy you groceries? Like whatever the things are that you need support with, can I sit with you and have a cup of coffee and listen? But the reality is that especially the months and the years, like kind of the time after the immediate loss, most people report that they feel like their support systems have kind of backed off a little bit, whether it's because the people who were supporting didn't know how to help, or because, there just aren't people there. And what you want to do is try to find people that can support you in kind of all realms of life. Again, kind of going back to those 4 realms. Can people offer practical support? Can they listen to your story, provide emotional support, spiritual support? Maybe you can partner up with a neighbor and you guys can join a club or do a hobby together. So there are lots of different ways we can find and access our support. But it may be that you need to be the one to take that step and say, I need more help than I have. I'm going to pause for a moment and talk about self-compassion. We can be really critical of ourselves in all areas, but I think especially when it comes to grief, we get a lot of subtle messaging that like, okay, enough time has passed, let's just move on and get back to normal. And while people hopefully are not outright saying that to you, although I certainly have heard stories where people do, I just want you to take a moment and just be gentle with yourself and to say, you know what, it's okay to still be wherever you are in your grief journey. And this researcher, Dr. Kristen Neff, has a whole website on self-compassion. And it's really just this idea of like thinking about what you would say to a friend who's grieving and turning that message inward. Like, I'm so sorry you're hurting. How can I be there to support you? It's okay that you're still having a hard time. What can we do to help you feel better? But really just to not be, cold or judgmental, but really to treat yourself with kindness and compassion. Okay. So we'll talk about continuing bonds. So these are the things that help us stay connected to a person who died. So I said that in the 4 tasks, that it's this idea of bringing your person with you as you're reinvesting in life. And it really is a both and. I think historically, like I'd say probably even until 20 or 30 years ago, and honestly a lot now, there's this idea that when the person dies, like the relationship is severed. That was the past. Now we're going to move forward. And there really was a belief that kind of breaking that relationship would help to move you through the grief process. We've come a long way in our understanding of what helps while we're grieving, and that is not it. What we find, and honestly, what people's natural relationship is or natural experience is that the relationship with the person hasn't stopped. It hasn't ended. It's different now, but those memories are there. I sometimes even think of like, my grandmother passed away almost 15 years ago. And I think sometimes in my head, like things she would say to me or advice she gave me, or, things I wish I could tell her. Like that relationship hasn't ended. She's not physically here. She's not audibly speaking to me. But my love for her and the lessons she taught me, those things are still very much a reality. So the continuing bonds are just the way that we are remaining connected to our person, maybe outwardly, like going to your husband's favorite restaurant on his birthday, or inwardly, just kind of thinking to yourself, oh, he would have loved this show. They are a natural part of the relationship. And so this idea of somehow like forgetting the person when they passed away, it just, seems so incongruent with the way that we have these relationships. They don't just stop. You don't just stop loving the person or missing the person or wishing they were here or, wondering what they would say to you in a certain situation. Those things continue. And I think you'll see here a bond, not a chain. That's an important thing here is that the bond is kind of us bringing this person with us, right? Their memory, their love for us, whatever it is that we're carrying with us. But what it is not is a chain keeping us in the past where we're not able to move forward and reinvest in the new reality. So a small word of caution, but there are so many ways that this can be lived out, and almost all of them are healthy. And then, of course, kind of, again, taking us back to those 4 tasks of mourning, it is still important that the death to be acknowledged. We're not living in some fantasy world where the person is still here, but we are finding ways to carry their memory and their the values, the things that they taught us with us as we move forward. Some common challenges of grief, and some of these really are external. This idea of the expectation to go back to normal. That is something I think most of us put on ourselves. But again, it's these kind of subtle cultural messages of, okay, well, we have to go back to work right after the loss, or, our friends are still inviting us to do all these things that we just don't feel ready for. We don't feel up for it. And so while their invitations are loving and caring, they're not trying to make us feel bad. There is kind of this feeling of like, well, gosh, should I be feeling like I'm ready to do this? This feeling of normal. And honestly, for a lot of people, normal never comes. The life feels different without the person, and that's okay. You can learn to live in this new environment, right? Adjusting to the new reality without the person. But to many people, that might not ever feel what we would consider normal, the way life was before. Another huge challenge is others stop saying the person's name or kind of intentionally like talk about topics that wouldn't pertain to the person who passed away. That can be very painful. People saying the wrong thing or not saying anything. I always think about The Elephant in the Room. There's actually a children's book with that title. And it's kind of this idea of like, you need to say the person's name. It's okay to say, I'm so sorry. I hear about your dad. Like, how are you doing? How are you doing? What's going on? And then difficulty enjoying celebratory events. And this is kind of tied back into the first one of expecting to go back to normal. But sometimes those, anniversaries or, graduations, weddings, whatever it is, they don't feel as happy. They're kind of bittersweet now. And it might be that way for a while. So just quickly, when is more help needed? So some considerations for this, it could be that you have access to a grief counselor, which if you're, the challenges you're facing are really specific to your grief, that would be a great option. Versus a therapist who can kind of assist more globally. So maybe your, grief is really kind of affecting, maybe bringing up some issues from the past, that kind of thing. That might be more helpful. And like I said, some agencies only offer grief counseling to the people who were their hospice patients. So it may be that you don't have specifically somebody named grief counselor available to you. And so finding a therapist would be the right approach. Of course, you can do online versus in person. There's insurance challenges you might face. And then, of course, the availability of therapists or counselors. But when to seek additional help, like no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you are having suicidal thoughts or homicidal thoughts, if you're having trouble completing your daily activities of living. So this is like bathing, getting dressed, feeding yourself, the things that you do to kind of get ready every day. If you're experiencing anxiety or depression that's impacting your functioning. And I think that's the key part there, impacting your functioning, because many of us are going to experience some level of anxiety and depression, kind of as part of the grief symptoms. But maybe you're still able to, take care of your children and go to work and, do what you needed to get done around the house, whatever, with those feelings. And then if you have a small or no support system, and again, kind of thinking back to our image with the concentric circles, some people truly just won't have very many people to put in there. And that's okay. We all have, different levels of support. But if you are a person that has a smaller support system, it may be that reaching out for some additional help would be good so you have a place to process through this grief. And then how to help others. So, you could say things like, I'm so sorry for your loss. I have a fond memory of the person that I'd love to share with you. That one is generally very well received. People want to know the impact that their loved one made in the world. I'm here to listen when you're ready, because sometimes we're not ready to talk, and it's okay to just sit and be quiet too. And then it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. So, not putting any pressure on the person to be back to normal or feel a different way than they feel. It's okay for them to feel angry. It's okay for them to feel sad, or worried or whatever. What not to say, at least, followed by anything. At least, they were 90 when they passed away. Well, does that really matter if I'm hurting? I don't really care how old they were. I wish they were still here. So anything you say, at least, probably not a good thing, or not a helpful thing. They're in a better place, usually well-meaning, but again, this idea of like, well, that might be true. That might be, what my spiritual or religious beliefs say, but I still wish they were here. It doesn't take away the pain that they're not here. You need to move on, and again, people might not be saying that outwardly, like outright, but kind of the hidden message. There's a reason for everything. Again, maybe true to your, religious or spiritual beliefs, but it really doesn't feel good to the griever to hear that said. And then I know how you feel. We all have unique experiences of our grief journey. And so even if you have experienced a similar loss, like both of you had your dad pass away, you don't know how the person feels because they are a different person. Some practical support ideas: listening always, bringing a meal, offering a specific task. This kind of goes back to the brain fog and the absent-mindedness. Sometimes it can just be so hard. I have no idea how to tell you what would be helpful to me. So making some suggestions. Hey, I'm going to the grocery store. Can I pick you up some things? Remembering special days can be so kind and loving. On Mother's Day or the person's birthday, the anniversary of the person's death, whatever it may be. Avoid offering advice and don't push them to move on. All right, so we're at the end. So thinking as we're moving forward with grief, it's this idea of learning to integrate the pain of the loss into our lives as we move forward. So finding moments of joy or peace, carrying your loved one with you, finding supportive and understanding people, and creating a meaningful life with the way things are now. And then lastly, some resources for you. There are actually quite a few grief websites that kind of help. These ones I know are fully vetted and offer great support. So the first one is the Mental Health America Fredericksburg chapter. This is a great place if you're looking for a therapist. They have a search tool, and actually you can fill out a form and they will help you search. Next is What's Your Grief? They have lots of articles you can read. And then the Dougy Center has great information for grieving kids. And I will leave it there. And Ashley, I'll hand it back to you.
Mary, thank you so much. That was fantastic, as always, but incredibly helpful. Just to really dive deep into what grief is and what happens and what the expectations are. So we really appreciate you sharing with us today.
Absolutely.
So again, please drop your questions in the chat. I don't see any questions right now, but we do have a couple of common questions that you get frequently. So some of them, we talked about what you should say to and not say to a friend or family member who's grieving. One question: my mom seems very depressed since my dad passed away. How can I tell if she needs more help? What
Yeah,
would you say?
that's a great question. And I think the tricky part here is that grief sometimes looks hard, right? I mean, if you've experienced this tough loss, I'd say the biggest thing there is when I talked about the activities of daily living. If the person is no longer getting out of bed, bathing, they've stopped doing things they enjoyed doing, if they aren't eating, kind of those things that we all need to do to survive, I'd say that's a huge red flag and that more help is needed. The hard part is that we have autonomy. We have the right to choose the care that we receive. So what is usually helpful is, rather than maybe you fill out the form on the Mental Health America website and get a few providers who would be available. And then, your mom could call those people as she's ready, or maybe you guys call together, if she's open to that. But I do think that so like if you're seeing things that are concerning in terms of not being able to care for herself. And then the other thing is if she's making any sort of statements about wanting to harm herself, it does get a little tricky because a lot of grieving people say things like, I just wish I was with my person, and we can receive that with a lot of empathy, and we can do a really hard thing that says, well, are you thinking about taking your own life? Um, Most people say no, oh, I would never do that. I just really miss my person. But it really is the most effective way to help somebody is to straight out ask the question, but it can be really hard.
Yeah, that's great advice. What about those who their loved one is still alive, but they're very sick, or they know that their passing is impending. They feel like they're already grieving. Is that normal? What do you say to that?
hmm So we actually have a word for it. It's called anticipatory grief. And I'm sure that if a person is listening who has a person that they love who is very sick, and even if they haven't been told that they have a life-limiting illness, but that they're sick, they've experienced a lot of loss, right? There's physical losses. A person who used to be able to walk and care for themselves now is in a bed and receives full-time 24-hour care. Um, a person who was able to speak and interact, converse normally, now has lost the ability to speak, or maybe they have dementia and so their words are kind of jumbled and they're not able to speak clearly. Those are lots of losses that people experience along the journey. And so we call that anticipatory grief. It's this the ability for our bodies to kind of process through some of these grief things before the person has passed away. Now, I hear both ways. Some people feel like, okay, well, now my person passed away and I'm in a very different spot than, say my next door neighbor whose loved one died of a heart attack suddenly. And so, like, when my person died, well, I've already been grieving for like 7 years. But I've also heard the opposite, that I'd been caring for this person for years, and yet when they died, it still felt like it was a shock. Like I had, like, almost like your brain was like, I had no idea this was going to happen, even though the doctors had been telling you for a long time. So I just want to normalize that even if you are someone who feels like they've been grieving for a long time, you still very likely will experience some significant grief after the loss as well.
Yeah, that's really good to know because I can imagine that that can be kind of jarring.
Mhm.
Um, and then kind of the final question that we have, and probably just getting right to the nitty gritty of it, is when will I feel better?
Mm. I wish I had an answer. You've heard me say lots of times that grief is unique to the individual. But I think what's not unique is that grief really is lifelong. Now, thinking about our circles in the Growing with Grief picture I showed during the beginning, the experience of that pain will likely get less over time, right? That, the pain that you felt when the loss first happened, it won't hurt as badly as it does years down the road. But that journey really is different for everyone. I'd say things that help are having a strong support system, and that could mean joining a support group because being with people who understand is really helpful. And then also kind of doing that other grief work of, feeling the pain and doing things to reinvest in the new reality, because we can get stuck. You can get stuck in the loss oriented side or the restoration oriented side. And it really is important to be doing both. So finding ways, if you feel like, it's been 5 years and, you still feel like you did on day one, well, maybe that's a little nudge to say, what kind of things can I do to start, caring for myself and processing through this grief? And maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you feel like I've been pretty fine, and now here we are 5 years later, and you're like, wow, this really hurts. I didn't realize. You could be a person who maybe spent a lot of time on the restoration oriented side, and now it's time to kind of dip your toes in the loss oriented side. So the short answer is that the pain will continue on. The real answer, I think, is that the pain doesn't have to feel as badly as it feels today, but you will likely always miss that person and always wish that they were here and always wish you could share those important, special things with them. And that's part of what we're learning to do, is to live with that pain and those wishes of wishing the person was here.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the beauty of loving someone that much, is the love doesn't really like go away when
Exactly.
they die. That you have to put it somewhere. So yeah, I think that's it's interesting that grief kind of takes the place of that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Mary, thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing all of this incredible information with us and really being very just uplifting about this process that can feel really daunting to people. So we really appreciate you being here. And to our listeners, we want to make sure you know that you are not alone. Grief can be really isolating, but we have a lot of resources for you. We have a lot of support. So if you go to griefsupport.mwhc.com, you can see a lot of the resources that Mary mentioned today. We also have her phone number and our email address if you're interested in more information about any of our support groups or our camps. And, we just want to really thank you for being here today and remind you to take good care of yourselves and remember that we're always here for you and help and connection is always available. Thank you so much and have a great night.